Hello, everyone. I'm Lynette Shultz. I'm a professor in the Department of Educational Policy Studies and the director of the Center for Global Citizenship Education and Research at the University of Alberta. My work is in education and particularly looking at international education, internationalization of education, global education, and looking for patterns in how education changes with a real eye to looking at social justice, equity, and so on. I work in the community in lots of different organizations, and I serve on the boards of the Global Center for Pluralism and the Asia Pacific Center for International Understanding. And I do a lot of work for UNESCO. I'm a senior expert advisor in education. So I bring those positions and that knowledge into my conversation with you today. And what I'll talk about is the SDG 4, thinking about what does it offer in terms of living together, learning to live together on a shared planet. So I take an education view of the issues and of the SDGs, and I look at what kind of responses education can make to the global issues that we face. And educators are ultimately a rather optimistic bunch. Our work shows that people can learn new ideas and they can change behaviors. And so when we look at global issues, educators look for places that we can learn to do things differently. And so my talk on education and the SDGs is based on that, and working with what we need to learn and how we need to read the world, as Paulo Freire would say, with the intention of transforming relations and systems. But I will say, one area of education that's really important is lifelong learning. So that's a reminder that it isn't easy work and it isn't easy learning. And we always need to be reading the world and working together on the issues that face us. So we're here to talk about the SDGs, and I'll speak about the vision of well-being that the SDGs provide and a role of education within that vision. When we look at the urgent global issues that face us, it's pretty obvious that we, meaning humans, need to make changes in how we think and act in the world. The SDGs provide a framework that describes how that can happen. It's one vision. It's a vision that came about because people around the world came together across geographies and disciplines and sectors and histories to contribute to a big vision, an integrated view from which we can begin to reframe how we think of life on a planet that's very stressed by human activity and how we respond in a way that includes both humans and non-humans. In order to understand what the task ahead is, if we want to learn to live together on a shared planet, I begin by talking about the legacies of colonialism. It needs to be a starting point, and that because it led us to this place. The challenge in considering the SDGs is that so many of the global engagements for the last centuries are tangled and defined by the global colonization project by European countries over that period. It created a world of division, of center-periphery relations, of colonial violence, and the destruction of people, other species, and the land, everywhere, along with creating a wealth distribution system that perpetuates that violence. So many people today call for a decolonizing of systems and relations, and a decolonizing education, or an anti-colonial solidarity that leads to sovereignty, a reclaiming that which was taken through colonialism. So knowledges, cultures, the capacity to thrive. From an education view, these are calls to do the hard work of unlearning in order to relearn how to live together on the planet. As an educator with the practice of engaging with global issues that impact us globally, which I mean beyond national borders, and of course locally, and everything in between, I view the SDGs as providing an opportunity to unlearn and to relearn. And to educators the world over, that's a pretty exciting idea. SDG is about education. It's a call for inclusive and equitable education that will contribute to all the other SDGs. It describes education beyond a narrow neoliberal notion of skilling workers and building human capital that's been promoted in the past decades of globalized education policy. SDGs frame education that could build historical consciousness and that views the planet not as a resource, but a living system on which we all depend. And this comes out of that integrated vision of all the SDGs together. The education described in SDG 4 talks of peaceful coexistence and justice that restores dignity and community well-being. It's education for democratic engagement that requires deliberation and the inclusion of local knowledges. To achieve SDG 4, ideas of colonialism, for example, organizing the world according to racism and sexism and ableism, where difference is ranked in hierarchies of privilege, must be unlearned. And in their place, we learn how people and issues are connected, about how the way to survive and even flourish is with diversity and difference, that the knowledge that sustained life on the planet does exist and has existed in the cultures and technologies and communities around the world. And here, that's where we run headlong into those structures of colonialism. We see how the legacies of colonialism have been sustained. As Achille Mbembe states in his 2021 book, Out of the Dark Night, we must not ignore the problem of whose knowledge is seen as legitimate in naming the problems and the visions of change. He said, and I'll quote, "The Western claim to epitomize the language and form in which any human event can arise, and even to have a monopoly on the very idea of the future, must be transformed." So while the SDGs might bring us together, we have to watch really carefully this global agenda with a commitment to sustained unlearning. Too often we only see how it works within the halls of global institutions in meetings of the world's elites. And then in local communities, the idea is to reproduce those. But this, I'm calling for something quite different. The work of education is localized, so it can show us what can be made from the SDG vision. Education does just that. So I find there are glimmers of hope in the classrooms and community education centers where students are stepping up to address the needs of the planet and its inhabitants. I'm going to share one such education project that I was involved with recently. It was a global classroom as an example where there's a great amount of unlearning and relearning, where relations across all kinds of difference were negotiated in order to collaborate on a climate change project. The project ended up being called the International Youth Deliberation on Just Energy Future. Here, a group of educators and researchers brought together teachers and secondary students in 22 schools in 18 countries to learn about climate change and the future of energy production and use. And as you can see on the slide, these schools were scattered around the world and from every continent. Central to the project is the concept of energy justice, which engaged not only with issues of equity in energy transition, but also with alternative ways of conceiving our futures, getting at the heart of what various societies value. Energy justice takes up key questions that address inequalities such as who has access and why? What are the impacts of this lack of access? Who benefits from energy transitions and who's disadvantaged? Students began by researching energy issues in their local context and then sharing with others in the global classroom. They worked together with students in another country. They were assigned into bilateral partners, and then they expanded that into continental groups. And all the while, they're sharing their research and their questions and posing critical questions for each other across these different groups of research groups. And finally, we ended with a big celebration of research, and it was a time of sharing over a week in an online global town hall. The process was really collaborative and dynamic with ongoing knowledge exchanges. And at the conclusion of the projects, students met virtually over a 4-day period, sometimes staying up all night, all of us, to summarize the collective vision for a just energy future and to prepare ways to disseminate the vision and the research that was at its core. They produced a video presentation, an opinion editorial, and an essay, which was shared, which is translated into several languages and is shared within their local communities, national agencies, and we had several presentations at a global level. And in these presentations, the students discussed the economic, cultural, and social components of just energy transition and the need for comprehensive energy education to support those intersecting elements. By the end of the project, the students formed a network of committed activists with a shared vision of a planet that is alive and well, and a map of what needs to be done to ensure it. In relation to the topic of today's conversation, this global classroom project reflected a pedagogy of unlearning to relearn. Each of the students scattered around the world recognized and felt the impacts of climate change. In their research and discussions together, they learned of the unevenness of these impacts and the roots of the social, economic, and political systems that underpin these differences. In the end, the students spent days together, analyzing and critiquing and learning how to bring informed action into their learning. Students described the future and the friendships they developed. A youth from Peru said, "We continued talking. We talk via WhatsApp and we share knowledge. We share personal things, and I think she's my best friend. I didn't expect I would have a friend from another continent, and it's really amazing for me." Another student explained that quote, "the bonds between all of us, how we became friends, just, some kind of a small family." So the students together doing this research across the many countries we wrestled with time zones, we wrestled with language, we used a lot of Google Translate and leaned on each other for translations and engagement. And in the end, it worked. In conclusion, I want to reiterate the important but challenging work that education can contribute to addressing the global issues we face. The SDGs can be a framework to challenge us to think and relate differently. Part of this educational process is the need to unlearn what has been made to seem natural in the long colonial period. At that point, it becomes possible to move toward a much better way of living together. Thank you.